Hello, my fellow military historians. It's lovely to see you again. Today, we continue to investigate one of the most amazing military encounters of old, the Greco-Persian Wars of the 5th century BC. Last time, we talked about the super famous Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks managed to score a remarkable victory over the stronger Persian force. While it was a victory, it was only the beginning of a great struggle. The Greeks defeated an expeditionary force, only to provoke a full-scale invasion. Before we jump into the battle, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the cause of the conflict. We'll start with the question of why.
Why?
Why did the Persian king Darius not like the Greeks very much? After all, they were small and politically insignificant to the Persians.
Because you're small and insignificant, and because I'll pummel you if you don't.
Aside from actively supporting the Ionian Revolt in 499 BC, the Greeks also gently pushed the Persian delegation, who were asking for earth, wind, and fire, into their deep well. Actually, they were only asking for earth and water, which is a Persian way of requesting total submission to the will of the King of Kings. Later, the Greeks would claim that it was cultural differences and simple misunderstandings that led to this tragic incident. But since the same story played out in both Athens and then Sparta, Darius suspected that the Greeks simply didn't like him all that much. And since he didn't like them either, in 486 BC, he was ready to strike with all his might. Or he would have been, if those restless Egyptians, who at the time were under Persian rule, hadn't messed it all up by rebelling against their more or less benevolent monarch. While politely explaining to his Egyptian subjects that it was simply inconsiderate of them to rebel at such an inopportune moment, Darius sadly died.
No one in this world can kill Darius,
leaving his son Xerxes in charge. And the boy had big Persian slippers to fill, and he decided to start proving his worth by taking up the family legacy of killing Greeks. He assembled a massive force and an even more impressive fleet, and crossed the Hellespont, or the Dardanelles, as we now know it. I think that it's remarkable that his army accomplished this crossing by building 2 giant pontoon bridges. Way to go, Xerxes! This time, the invasion was real, backed by the full faith and credit of the Persian government. So, how big was his army? Our main source, the somewhat reliable Greek historian Herodotus, had a tendency to embellish his reports, and in this battle, he exaggerated everything by a factor of 4. In some ways, he was more of a sensational journalist than a real historian. He suggested that the Persian army had over 1 million soldiers. While we have no way to prove him wrong, British historians at Oxford seem to be convinced that the number was just shy of 300,000. In either case, it was one of the largest armies ever assembled in that part of the world. The army marched on land across the east coast of modern Greece while the fleet was shadowing it along the same coast. The Greeks knew that the best place to stop the army was at a narrow strip of land near the Hot Gates, or the Gates of Fire, the Thermopylae, through which the Persians had to pass in order to get to all major Greek cities, like Athens or Sparta. And so, the Greeks decided to stop the Persians there. Unlike the Battle of Marathon, where the commanding initiative belonged to Athens, this time, Sparta was in charge. I hardly even need to mention the fact that Sparta was a unique and highly militaristic society where adult males could pretty much do one thing and one thing only: become a soldier. Unlike other Greek city-states where most soldiers had civilian occupations and were called up in times of trouble, Spartans had a real professional standing army. The Greek city-states sent almost 7,000 soldiers, and yet, we know this army as the 300. Why? Well, Sparta contributed 300 elite warriors, led by the king Leonidas, who immortalized themselves during the Battle of Thermopylae. The Persian army arrived at the pass of Thermopylae in late August. Xerxes sent a Persian emissary to negotiate with Leonidas. The Greeks were offered their freedom, the title Friends of the Persian People, and the opportunity to resettle on better land. When Leonidas refused these terms, the ambassador carried a written message from Xerxes, asking him to hand over your arms. Leonidas' famous response to the Persians was, "Come and get them." At this point, a battle was inevitable, and while the Persians could not comprehend why 7,000 Greeks chose to fight against a 300,000 strong army, Leonidas had a plan. Just like during the Battle of Marathon, Greeks took full advantage of the terrain. Tactically, the pass at Thermopylae was ideally suited to the Greek style of warfare. A hoplite phalanx could easily block the narrow pass, with no risk of being outflanked by cavalry. The pass was only 100 meters wide, and so time was on the Greek side, as the massive Persian army couldn't remain in one place for long. Due to the sheer size of their force, they needed to supply it with provisions, while maintaining basic levels of sanitation, which simply wasn't feasible for long while staying and fighting the Greeks. On the 5th day after the Persian arrival at Thermopylae, Xerxes resolved to attack, and ordered as many as 5,000 archers to send a hail of arrows towards the Greek formation. Despite its intimidating appearance, this effort failed miserably, as the Greek phalanxes were heavily armed, and their bronze-covered shields served as a great protective wall. A funny tidbit for you is that the Greeks, particularly the Spartans, didn't employ archers, as they thought of it as the weapon of cowards. Next, the Persians launched a frontal assault in waves of around 10,000 men, pushing the Greeks right in front of the wall of the pass, at the narrowest part of it. And here, once again, the superiority of the Greek armor shined, both figuratively and literally, with the Persians, despite their overwhelming numbers, simply crumbling under the pressure of the Greek shields and spears. This superiority in armor was added to the simple beauty of the standard Greek phalanx, in which the men formed a wall of overlapping shields and layered spear points protruding out from the sides of the shields, which would have been highly effective, as long as it spanned the entire width of the pass. Add to this fact that the Spartans, the ultimate professional warriors, represented the core of the Greek army, and one can see why Xerxes had developed a legitimately massive headache, figuring out how to defeat the Greeks. The second day brought no relief to the king's headache, nor did his stash of Tylenol, as another Persian infantry attack simply collapsed, despite the overwhelming numerical superiority. Luck did smile that day on Xerxes, as a Greek traitor named Ephialtes informed the king of the existence of a secret passage through the mountains. The passage that could lead the Persians behind the Greek lines, thus surrounding them. That night, Xerxes sent one of his best commanders, Hydarnes, with 20,000 men, most of whom were the elite immortals, guided by the Greek traitor through the mountain passage, which then offered the solution to the king's Greek problem. The passage, however, was not all that much of a mystery to Leonidas, as he had already placed a detachment of the Greek allies to guard against this specific outflanking maneuver. While they couldn't have held 20,000 elite Persian troops for long, it gave the Greek commanders time to deliberate what to do next. Leonidas used this window of opportunity to allow the majority of his troops to withdraw, leaving him and 2,000 of his soldiers, mostly Spartans, to hold the position, despite the inevitable encirclement by the Persians. This heroic action of the Spartans has often been questioned as a poor military decision, which resulted in the loss of lives of the best Greek fighting force. Given the fact that the Persians had cavalry, I believe that the rearguard action was absolutely necessary. And if the entire army was to just pack up and leave, then the Persian horsemen would have caught up with them soon, with devastating consequences. At dawn, Xerxes sent 10,000 light infantry and cavalry to destroy the remaining Greek forces, who moved away from the protective walls of the pass in order to maximize Persian casualties. The Greeks had no chance, and under heavy fire from the Persian archers who occupied nearby hills, nearly all of them were slaughtered, including King Leonidas himself. All in all, the Greeks lost 3,500 men, about half their force, while inflicting a much greater casualty count on the Persians, who lost over 22,000 soldiers, including 2 brothers of King Xerxes, in the Battle of Thermopylae. Despite the legacy of this battle, from a military perspective, it was an unconditional defeat for the Greeks, with not much to justify those losses, besides a Hollywood movie. So why, about 2,500 years later, do we still remember this encounter? I think that the idea of martyrdom has always been an appealing symbol for political efforts to centralize and unify societies that enjoyed a common language and traditions, yet were politically separated. The Greek city-states represented a prime example of this type of society, and the sacrifice of King Leonidas did accomplish its goal of becoming a rallying cry that eventually led to the unification of their military efforts. And who can resist the idea of free people standing up to a giant empire, even if reality is more complicated than this Hollywood-like image? And as King Leonidas and his men lay dead, the Persian army marched on unopposed, with the pass of Thermopylae open to them. They proceeded to march into the barely evacuated city of Athens and burn it to the ground. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet, which was blockading Artemisium to prevent the outflanking maneuver from the Persian navy, had no need to continue their efforts. And with the naval battle of Artemisium ending inconclusively, the Greeks simply withdrew into the Saronic Gulf in good condition, ready to fight another day. And that day was fast approaching, with the Greek fleet breaking the military might of the awesome Persian naval machine at the Battle of Salamis, my favorite engagement of the Greco-Persian conflict, and the topic of our next and last episode. Make sure that you don't miss the final part of this battle by clicking the notification bell, and please like, comment, and subscribe as well. Thanks for watching my channel. Say it with me, the most intriguing military battles.